In 1978, 5 men went missing in Yuba County, California. 4 of the men were later found dead on and around a remote mountain path, 2 hours from where they were last seen alive. 4 of the men died in suspicious, very odd circumstances, and the 5th man was never seen again and to this day remains a missing person. What actually happened that night, as well as answers to dozens of questions about the strange and deadly decisions of these men, remain unanswered and unknown. This is just one of the many mysteries that we will be exploring in this episode. So without further ado, grab a drink. My choice today is black coffee, and join me as we explore the unsolved mystery Iceberg. We are on the last few entries of tier 3 out of 11, and so to start off with, we have Sergeant Patrick Rust. He was a 24-year-old US soldier found dead just 6 months after disappearing from a bar in New York. This was in 2007, and he had just finished 2 tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. So while in New York, he went out drinking one night, and his skeletal remains were found 6 months later in a field about 5 miles from the bar. His army dog tags were missing, but he still had $80 in his pocket that wasn't taken, meaning that he likely wasn't robbed. There have been no suspects in the case, no determined cause of death, and his case is still open 16 years later. The Sheepsquatch is a white woolly-haired creature, reportedly seen across various counties in West Virginia. It is described as being roughly the size of a bear, having 4 legs, a pointed head, and sharp saber-like teeth. It also has a set of large horns, similar to a goat, incredible claws, and is said to smell of sulfur. There have been numerous sightings over the years since 1994, but the elusive Sheepsquatch has never been captured either on camera or in person. The ship of Theseus is a very, very interesting thought experiment. In the story, Theseus, the mythical founder of Athens, had a great ship, and every year the Athenians would honor Theseus by taking the ship on a pilgrimage to Delos. Over the years, as ships tend to do, it required maintenance and the changing out of parts. The question arose, if you take the ship and replace a few bolts, is it still the same ship? And most people would probably say yes. So then, if you also replace a single plank on the deck, would it still be the same ship? Again, most people would probably answer yes. The idea is, if changing one piece at a time keeps it as the same ship, would you still have the same ship if, over the years, one by one, you changed out every single part of the ship so that no pieces or parts of the original ship remained? This is a very interesting idea, exploring the definitions we put on things. And I've also seen this argument made for stuff like a whirlpool, where you get certain whirlpools that can last for quite a long time, and you could identify them as that whirlpool, even though none of the water or matter in the actual whirlpool is ever the same. The water is constantly flowing in and out of the whirlpool, so what we call the whirlpool isn't based on matter, but is really based on a common or familiar pattern. But it is still interesting nonetheless. The Sliver Cat is a terrifying creature said to live in North America. It is a large 300-pound cat with tasseled ears and horizontally split red eyes. Its main distinctive feature is its large tail, which is over 3 meters or 11 feet in length. And on the end of the tail is a large bony club that is smooth on one side and spiked on the other side. It is said to hang from tree branches and wait until its next victim walks by. Then it knocks it unconscious with its clubbed tail and uses the spiked end of its tail to impale its victim, drag it up the tree, and eat it at its own leisure. Spix's macaw spotted in the wild. So the Spix's macaw was made famous in the Rio animated film and is a rare blue parrot thought to be extinct in the wild. In 2016, one was spotted flying through the trees in Brazil for the first time in 15 years. Since that sighting, it has never been spotted again or captured, and its location, if it does remain alive, is unknown. There is a large colony of Spix's macaw being bred in Qatar, and Brazil had plans of reintroducing the Spix's macaw back into the wild, but they hadn't started it yet, and so where this solitary macaw came from is still a little uncertain. Stanton Bones. So this is a really odd but interesting one. Dr. Carrie Quillen Stanton owned a private island and was always a unique, eccentric man. But after his death in 1987, what they found on the island shocked everyone. Carrie was a doctor who, at just 34 years old in 1957, returned from New York back to California to run his family's ranch on Santa Cruz Island, which his family actually owned 90% of. This was the largest of California's Channel Islands, and his father, who was an oil and businessman, bought the island for $1 million back in 1937. So Carrie moved back, and when his parents died, he took control of the ranch and the island. He was very protective of the island, and he was a very particular and eccentric man. And one time he was walking along the beaches of the island where he found a trash bag. Inside the trash bag he found, amongst other things, an envelope with the name and address of a popular yacht lender in Ventura, which is about 40 miles away on the mainland. He took the trash bag, went all the way to the offices in Ventura, threw it down on the guy's desk, and said, "Excuse me, sir, I believe you left this on my island." He led a mostly solitary life on the island, but did occasionally welcome visitors, and over the years he developed a very, very rigid routine that he expected all of his guests to abide by. Dinner was always semi-formal and begun precisely at 7:30 in the evening. The weekly menu never changed, and at exactly 8:30 p.m. him and all of his guests would go to the living room for coffee and dessert, and the only dessert he ever served on the island was oatmeal cookies. Then he went to bed at exactly 9 p.m. Carrie strictly followed this routine up until his death in 1987, and in 1990, while searching the island, the agricultural commissioner found a 19th century shed, and inside this shed he found a tightly sealed copper box. This was very unusual, and when he opened the box, he found cremated human remains. No one on the island knew about this copper box, when the remains were put there, or who they belonged to. They also found a clothing fastener from the 1940s, as well as several false teeth from the 1950s, and a diamond-studded platinum ring from before World War II. The remains were believed to have been from a woman who died in the 1950s or 60s, and it is unknown whether Carrie even knew about this box and the remains, as he was said to be very neat and meticulous, and labeled almost everything on the island. So having a random unlabeled copper box full of human remains seemed a little out of character for him. But maybe he was hiding something, or maybe it was his parents who were responsible for this. Either way, the identity of this cremated woman remains unknown, and it is unlikely that she will ever be identified. Stickdeath.com. So I'll make this one quick, as it is technically, as of 2022, not unsolved anymore. Stickdeath.com was a website created in 1996, which is super long ago in terms of internet time. It contained various animations and games of stick figures in various situations and stories. It was pretty awesome for the 1990s. But in 2007, the site was closed. When it was closed, a lot of the content that was on the site was essentially lost and deemed as lost media. But as of 2022, every piece of content that was on the site has been located and re-uploaded. So it is no longer lost media. Some of the content they had on there is pretty cool, and it's super nostalgic and reminiscent of the 90s and early 2000s internet, if you want to go check it out. The striped jaguar is a cryptid said to live in the rainforests of Peru, Colombia, and Ecuador. It is described as being the same size as a jaguar, but with white stripes instead of the black dots that it normally has. Its head is slightly more narrow than a jaguar, and it has been said to track and kill hunters. Susan Powell was an American woman who went missing in Utah 2009. It is in fact believed that she was killed by her husband, Joshua Powell, but he was never charged for her murder or disappearance, so let me know what you think in the comments below. On December 9th, 2009, Susan went to the morning church service with her two sons, Charles and Braden, and later that day a neighbor would visit the household and would leave at around 5 in the evening. This neighbor would be the last person outside of the family to see Susan alive. So the next day, when neither Josh nor Susan showed up to work, and when the two boys hadn't been dropped off at their daycare, the family's relatives reported the entire family missing. Police initially did a search and ended up actually breaking into the house, as they suspected that the entire family had maybe died of carbon monoxide poisoning. When they entered the house, however, they didn't find any of the family. But what they did notice was two fans turned up to full blast, pointing at a single damp spot on the couch. Susan's purse, wallet, and ID were all found found in the house, so her having run away seems a lot less likely. And her cell phone was later found in the family's vehicle, so they had no idea where the family had gone. Until around 5 in the evening that day, Joshua returned home with the 2 boys and was obviously taken into questioning. He said that he had left to go on a camping trip with the 2 boys just after midnight, and he left Susan sleeping at home. The police were unable to find or locate the campsite that Joshua said they'd gone to, and they thought it was very, very weird that Joshua had taken the 2 boys out camping after midnight in cold, blizzard-like conditions when they were due to be in daycare just a few hours later. And Joshua hadn't told his boss that he wasn't going to be in that day because he told the police that he thought it was a Sunday instead of a Monday. So all of this is already starting to sound a little bit suspicious. And a few days later, investigators found traces of Susan's blood on the floor of the family home. They found various life insurance policies taken out for Susan, amounting to roughly $1.5 million, and a handwritten letter from Susan expressing fear for her life. Joshua, even since he was a kid, was known to have killed one of his sister's gerbils and to have threatened his mum with a butcher knife. So yeah, not the most grounded of individuals. Joshua later liquidated Susan's retirement accounts. He took his kids out of daycare, and there was evidence that he had previously spoken to co-workers regarding how one would hide a body in one of the abandoned mine shafts in the western Utah desert. So this was not looking good for Joshua, and later his son, Charlie, did confirm that they had gone on a camping trip as Joshua said. He said that his mother, Susan, had gone with them, but she didn't return. Weeks later, the 2 boys reportedly claimed that their mother was dead, and one of them drew a picture of a van with 3 people in the front of it, and then told the carers that Mummy was in the trunk. This case goes very deep into stuff like Joshua's dad, Stephen, who was abusive to Joshua and his siblings as a kid. Stephen being arrested for possessing thousands of photos of underage girls, and even of Susan herself, all of which were taken secretly and without their knowledge. Joshua fought multiple lawsuits against the police in regards to his involvement in the disappearance and potential murder, and there was a website that was made purporting to fully explain Susan's life and situation, but the website actually subtly said that Susan was crazy, manipulative, and probably ran off with another man, abandoning her family. The website and posts were thought to have been made by Joshua and his brother. So after all of this, Joshua was deemed unfit to take care of his kids, and custody of the boys was given to Susan's parents. And one time after the boys were brought to Joshua's house for a supervised visit, Joshua grabbed and pulled the 2 boys inside, shut the door on the social worker, and soon after this, the house exploded, killing Joshua and the 2 boys. The boys had axe wounds on their heads and necks, and there were 2 5-gallon cans of gasoline found on the premises. So it is thought that Joshua lit the house on fire, picked up the axe and attacked his 2 boys before being overwhelmed by the smoke and fire. It is thought that Joshua's brother Michael had at least knowledge of what Joshua did, and at most was an accomplice in these murders. And roughly 1 year after the explosion, Michael died after jumping from the roof of a parking garage. So this one was incredibly disturbing and heartbreaking, as it always is when kids are involved. It seems, at least to me, like a pretty open and shut case, but because Joshua and Michael were both cowards, Susan's family never got justice for their daughter, and her 2 boys were sadly, monstrously taken out of this world by their own father. Synchronicity is a concept in psychology first introduced by Carl G. Jung. It describes circumstances that appear meaningfully connected, yet lack a causal connection. Like, for instance, when you learn a word that you've never seen before, and then notice it in a book that you are reading the very same day. Or when you are thinking about someone and then receive a phone call from that person. Jung was a fantastic psychologist, and while the idea of synchronicity is purely hypothetical and not strictly scientific, he felt that it was relevant enough to warrant its own concept, even if he never fully proved it. There have been several refined definitions over the years, such as a meaningful coincidence of 2 or more events, where something other than the probability of chance is involved. And while you have ideas like the placebo effect, where the placebo doesn't strictly actually do anything, but if the person thinks the placebo is doing something, then it does actually have physical implications. 2/3 of therapists actually believe that synchronicity experiences could be useful for therapy. So if you're a fan of Jung or psychology, definitely check this one out. The Texerkana Moonlight murders. This was a series of 5 unsolved murders and violent crimes committed in and around Arkansas and Texas in 1946. These were attributed to the killer known as the Phantom of Texerkana, or simply the Phantom Killer or Phantom Slayer. The killer mostly targeted couples, and the first 3 attacks were on lovers' lanes, or quiet areas and roads that couples would park up on in order to make out. The 4th attack was in a farmhouse in Arkansas, and after this, the whole of Texarkana went into panic mode. Shops were selling out of guns, ammo, and locks, and some people even tried to bait out the killer, going to these lovers' lanes, parking up, and just waiting there with a loaded gun. But the killer never struck again. Of the 4 couples that he attacked, 5 of the victims sadly died, and the prime suspect was a man called Yule Sweeney, who was a petty career criminal who was linked to the murders through statements that his wife made as well as through circumstantial evidence. But when his wife decided not to testify against him, the prosecutors decided not to press for murder charges, as the evidence for the case just wasn't there. Sweeney was given quite a long sentence for other unrelated crimes, but to this day, nobody has served time for these killings. The Cure for Insomnia is an 87-hour-long film created by John Henry Timmis IV. It was recognized by the Guinness World Records as the longest film ever created. So subscribe and leave a like down below, guys, and if we get 500 likes, I will do an 87-hour-long episode. The film consisted of actor L.D. Groban reading a 4,080-page poem titled A Cure for Insomnia. This was spliced with heavy metal music and adult content, if you know what I mean. The idea of the film was to cure insomniacs by reprogramming their biological clock, and it was shown at the School of the Art Institute in Chicago from January 31st to February the 3rd, and was otherwise never released, with all copies of the film believed to have been lost. Maybe they did truly stumble across the cure for insomnia, and the whole film and operation was shut down by Big Pharma. It's a theory. The Television Ghost was an early television program broadcast in New York City in the early 1930s. The show centered on the idea of ghosts telling stories of how they were killed. Each episode featured a different story and a different ghost, but the ghost was always played by the same actor, George Kelting, who was dressed up roughly the same every time, with a white painted face and a sheet wrapped around him. This wasn't incredibly advanced as it was the 1930s, and it was kind of closer to a radio show, with the video footage of Kelting being mostly a static shot of his head and shoulders as he was telling the stories. Each episode was 15 minutes long, and it ran for 2 years before being stopped in 1933. It is often thought to be the first dramatic television anthology or series ever released, but because it was made so early, no footage of it is thought to have survived. The Younger Lady is the unofficial name of a mummy found in the Valley of the Kings in 1898. There was some speculation as to her identity when she was first found, but through DNA tests, she was shown to be the daughter of the Pharaoh Amenhotep III, a sister and wife to the Pharaoh Akhenaten, and the mother of the Pharaoh Tutankhamun. Despite all of these connections, she doesn't seem to have been a prominent figure in her own lifetime. It is thought that she was likely killed by a blunt force hit to the face, but whether this was from something like a chariot accident, or a kick in the face from a horse, or whether it was intentional through something like a axe or hammer attack, remains to this day a mystery. The unknown Great Train Robbers. So, the Great Train Robbery was quite a famous event, where in 1963, 15 men robbed a Royal Mail train heading from Glasgow to London. They stole £2.6 million in cash, which today is the equivalent of around £61 million. After the robbery, the gang hid out on a farm, which the police later found, along with a bunch of incriminating evidence, like a game of Monopoly that they were apparently playing, along with fingerprints of all of the robbers. They were eventually arrested, and the ringleaders were given a sentence of 30 years. But most of the money stolen was actually never recovered. And after everyone was arrested, arrested, there were still 3 or 4 robbers that were never identified, and so were never convicted for the robbery. Their identity to this day remains a mystery, and though they are probably dead by now, as this was in the 1960s, they likely made off with a lot of money. Unusual Doctor Who episode recoveries. So Doctor Who, for those who don't know, is a long-running sci-fi TV series in the UK that first aired in 1963 and is in fact still running to this day. It was the inspiration for Inspector Spacetime for any Community fans out there, and between 1967 and 1974, the BBC would regularly wipe and delete old tapes in order to save money by reusing them for new content, and a lot of the tapes that were wiped were Doctor Who episodes. They later stopped wiping tapes and decided to archive them all, but for the first 6 seasons there are 97 episodes that have never been fully recovered, with only small clips and audio from the episodes surviving. It is possible that these episodes might be recovered, but it is thought very unlikely, and the odds are that these 97 episodes will forever remain lost media. The Will of the Wisp is a phenomenon in European folklore that resembles a flickering lamp or lantern, and is said to mislead travelers into sometimes dangerous situations. It goes by a few names depending on where you're from: Will-o-wisp, Ignis Fatuus, which is Latin for foolish flame, Jack-o'-lantern, Friar's lantern, or my personal favorite, the Hinky Punk. Similar phenomena has been noted all over the world, like the St. Louis light in Saskatchewan, the Spook light in Missouri, the Marfa light in Texas, the Naga fireballs in Thailand, and the Hestdalen light in Norway. But in the European folklore, both Will and Jack actually just refer to the names Will and Jack, with a lantern obviously being a light and a wisp being a lit kindling of sorts. And one Irish version of the tale involves a ne'er-do-well called Drunk or Stingy Jack. So in the story, the devil comes to collect Jack's soul. Jack agrees, but tricks the devil into turning himself into a coin so that he can buy one last drink before he goes. So the devil turns himself into a coin, but Jack just places him in his pocket next to a crucifix, which stops the devil from turning back into his original form. So in exchange for his freedom, the devil grants Jack 10 more years. Then when the devil returns to take Jack's soul, Jack once again tricks him into climbing up a tree. Then he carves a crucifix below the tree, preventing the devil from coming down from the tree. So in exchange for the devil's freedom this time, the devil agrees not to pursue Jack. When Jack does eventually die, he is not allowed into heaven, and when he goes down to hell, the devil won't let him in there either. I guess he was just bitter from being tricked so often, but he does give Jack a flame from the fires of hell. As Jack can neither go to heaven or hell, he is forced to walk the earth forever, and so uses this flame to guide his way. So he takes this ember and places it into a carved out turnip, which was what they originally used before pumpkins, and this served as a lantern to guide his way. And so that is how Jack-o'-lanterns were born. The Yuba County 5 is a case that I could and might consider doing a full video on. This was regarding the deaths and disappearance of 5 young men in California 1978. They each had mild intellectual and learning disabilities, and after attending a basketball game and stopping by a store to purchase sodas and snacks, the group was never seen alive again. After not returning home the following day, the parents of some of the men reported them missing. Initially, they didn't really have much to go on, but soon the car that they were traveling in was spotted over 70 miles away, abandoned on a mountainous trail in a forest. The location was very odd as the men were all fairly lightly dressed, and nobody could really figure out why the men would travel up this long, winding mountainous road in the middle of a winter night. Inside the car were empty cartons and wrappers from what the men had purchased in the store, but the men themselves were nowhere to be found. There was evidence to suggest that the car had been lightly stuck in the snow, but experts said that the snow wouldn't have been deep enough, that they couldn't have just pushed the car free. The car was otherwise in perfect working condition, and when police hotwired the car, it started up immediately and still had plenty of gas left in the tank. When the car was taken in for inspection, the mystery just got even deeper. The underside of the car had no scratches or bumps or gouges, despite driving a long distance up this difficult, bumpy mountain path. This This meant that either the driver was extremely careful or had extensive knowledge and experience of the surrounding area and maybe of this particular road, and was able to maneuver through it without damaging the car. And the driver that night, one of the 5 men, was not known to have this knowledge or skill. On top of that, the car was also left unlocked with the window rolled down. 2 of the men were found dead in the snow 11 miles from the car, and later on another 2 were found dead either in or around a trailer that was maintained by the United States Forest Service. There are so many details in this case, which is why I might do a full video on this later on if anyone wants to see it. But the man inside the trailer, Ted Weyer, had lost about 45 kilos and had a long beard, suggesting that he had been alive in the trailer after his disappearance for about 3 months. This trailer was actually partly designed for emergencies, and so it was heavily supplied with almost everything that you would need to survive. There was enough food in the trailer to feed all 5 of the men for over a year that was completely untouched. There were plenty of matches and fuel in the trailer, and gas to heat the trailer, and none of these were used. And there were heavy winter clothes inside the trailer that again weren't even touched. This whole thing is incredibly strange, considering they didn't die immediately, surviving for at least a month or 2, and everyone that did died either died of hypothermia or starvation, when there were plenty of readily available resources to fix both of these issues. The 5th man in the group, Theseus, was never found, and to this day his fate and whereabouts remain unknown. There are so many questions and details regarding this case, and if anyone wants to see it, I promise to cover the entire case in detail in a future video. The zip gun bomber was an unidentified figure who, beginning in 1982, began terrorizing New York citizens by mailing booby-trapped packages to various people. The first package was sent to 54-year-old high school counselor Joan Betty Kipp. She received a cookbook in the mail, and when she opened it, she was shot by a gun inside of the cookbook, and she unfortunately died hours later. Then, a whole 10 years later, 4 more packages were sent out to various residents of New York. One containing a medallion, which, when opened, shot and hit the recipient and 2 of his relatives. Thankfully, none of the people hit actually died. Then, 75-year-old Alice Caswell was shot by a similar package containing a medallion. Then, 18-year-old Stephanie Gaffner, who was actually 8 months pregnant at the time, opened a package containing a book and was hit by shrapnel of 3 bullets. Thankfully, both her and the baby survived, and she gave birth to a healthy girl just a few months later. The last attack was on 77-year-old Richard Bazile, who opened a parcel containing a video cassette, which then exploded. He wasn't hit or injured by the attack, thankfully, and police weren't ever really able to determine whether the attacks were targeted or were just completely random. There were a few suspects for the attacks, one of whom being the first victim, Joan's husband, but to this day, the identity of the zip gun killer remains a mystery. Mr. Cruel is the name given to an unidentified serial child assaulter who attacked 3 girls in Australia in the 1980s and 90s, and is the prime suspect for a 1991 abduction and murder of a 4th girl. The police describe him as highly intelligent, as he meticulously and carefully planned each of his attacks, cutting phone lines, conducting surveillance on his victims and their families. He ensured that he left 0 forensic evidence or traces. He covered his face fully at all times, left multiple red herrings or fake clues for the police, and he was threatening but soft-spoken and calm during his attacks. His MO was to stalk out these houses, cut the phone lines, break in the middle of the night, tie up or incapacitate the parents, and then assault or kidnap the girls. There is more than $1 million reward for information leading to the capture and arrest of this man, but as of today, he has not been identified or captured. And that is all we have time for. I really hope you enjoyed this week's episode and hopefully learned a thing or 2 from it. I really enjoyed making it, and we are now done with Tier 3. Next week we will be starting off on Tier 4, and the mysteries will just get darker and deeper from there. I do have some non-Iceberg videos in the works, so definitely keep an eye out for those. And as always guys, thanks for watching.